It is good to see you. I'm just going to drop this down a little bit. Maybe I'm not. Oh, there we go. A little bit. Okay, I think we have this sort of strange thing in life where we don't want to have to rely on anyone else but ourselves, yet at the same time, we know how completely unreliable we are. Right? I mean, I don't know if you ever think like that. You're like, I mean, if I could detach myself, look at myself from the third person, I'd be like, why would I want to rely on him? It's like, why would I want to rely on somebody who doesn't look like he can dress himself properly, who eats far too many burgers for his own good, and 101 other things that I know are sort of unreliable about myself? Yet we still want to stand there and go, I don't want to rely on anyone else but myself. It's kind of a strange thing, really, isn't it? And in Christian circles, the mantra for us, the sort of phrase is, trust God, rely on God. But to say I rely on God is so much easier than actually doing it. Actually doing it, actually living it out, that's a very different story. And of course, it's much easier to say I rely on God when we've got family and friends and our finances and our bank account and our credit cards to fall back on. I think each of us sitting here today, we're tempted to always try and control our surroundings and our circumstances. And so we're drawn to whatever helps us to control. And that might be our own strength, our own skills. It might be our competency in certain things. It might be self-determination. It might be power. It might be money. We're tempted by those things because they help us control our life. But at the same time, no matter how many of those things we have, time and time and time and time again, we fail. And what do we make of this? What do you think God makes of our sort of self-defeating scramble for control? I think there's a really big lesson embedded in the life of Moses. Now, we're coming to start this series, Caring for Your Soul. But you know what? Actually, I think Colin started this series 3 weeks ago. Now, before you jump at me, I know we're starting a new series today, but Colin was ending your previous series talking about learning from Jesus. And if you were here, he spoke with extreme vulnerability about brokenness. And if that isn't the start of caring for your soul, I don't know what is. That ability to look inside ourselves and to see what we're really like and what has really shaped us. So thank you, Colin, for that. I think that phrase, caring for our soul, is in many ways a concept that we're all really familiar with, right? I mean, the world talks about it all the time. It gives words and ideas and practices to care for the inner you. It's really popular at the moment. But what the world sees as soul and what we view as soul is actually really different. You see, the world says it's about self-care. It's about mental health days. It's about taking rest. It's about having a spa day. It's about grounding yourself. Or it's about treating yourself to some triple chocolate brownie or whatever it is. And none of those things are bad. Of course they're not. In many ways, they can be quite good for us. But I don't think that's taking care of our soul. You see, this word soul is quite a strange word. I mean, we all know what it means, but we'd all struggle to explain it. It's that bit that makes me, me. And the bit that makes Emma, Emma. And the bit that makes you, you. It's our inner place. It's that hidden voice. It's the essence of who I am. And of course, it holds so much of who we are. It holds our character, it holds our feeling, it holds our consciousness, it holds our memory, it holds our perception, it holds our thinking, it holds our likes, it holds our dislikes. But somehow it's more than just those things. And actually, all that I've just described doesn't come from the Bible. It comes from Plato and his dualism, splitting of mind and body. So we struggle to describe what this soul really is. And in the Christian world, in Christian belief, our soul is the immortal bit of us, the bit that never dies. Someday, sometime, we're all going to die, but it's our bodies that die. And I hate to say this, but it's our bodies that will rot in the ground. But our soul is the bit that goes on. Our soul is the bit that is eternal, that will live forever. And it's our soul that will be judged by Jesus on the final day. It's not your body, but it's the bit that makes you you. Now, if we go to the Bible, the Old Testament, that's the first bit of the Bible, the Old Testament, no matter the tribe, no matter the nation, no matter whether they're the people of God or not, they would have struggled to understand the word soul as we say it. There's this Hebrew word, nephesh, which we translate soul, but it's actually a word that's connected much more to life. You see, we're struggling to even translate the word. Nephesh is this word that means life and wholeness. It doesn't mean soul as we understand soul. In the book of Genesis, where the breath of life is breathed into Adam, it's not that he was given nephesh. It's not that at that moment he was given a soul. It's actually at that moment when the breath comes, he became a living soul. And it's a slight distinction, but a really important distinction. Now, what this series is about taking care of that indescribable bit of us. And if you want to do some homework, if you want to get into this, can I just recommend reading the book of Psalms? I mean, we're not looking at it today, but read the book of Psalms. If there's any book in the Bible that understands the soul, it's Psalms. It's gritty, it's honest, it's got this complex array of emotions, and it sort of validates our soul through poetry and through song, and it gives this window into who we are. A lot of the Psalms were written by King David, as I'm sure you know, and it tracks the ups and downs of his life. And what intrigues me as I read the Psalms, and maybe for you if you go and do your homework, is actually this relationship that David has with his own soul. He actually holds conversations with his own soul. I mean, there's this example I think I've got coming up. This is a famous bit. As the deer longs for flowing water, so my soul longs for you, God. My soul thirsts for you, God. You know, it's like he's having this conversation with himself. He reminds us that our souls need refreshing by the presence of God. Psalm 63 tells us the soul can be hungry. I mean, I think of my stomach as being hungry most of the time. But Psalm 63 says our souls can hunger. Psalm 23 says that our souls need rest. Not just our bodies need rest, but our souls need rest. The Psalms teach us that our soul can be fearful because our souls need to take refuge. And above all, guard your heart, guard your soul, because everything you do flows from it. So if we're going through this Care for Your Soul series, we're going to anchor it in the life of Moses. which was the reading that Emma brought to us. How did Moses guard and care for his soul in the midst of the struggles he had? And today, which kind of starts the series off, we're looking at caring for our soul by addressing what's beneath. Sounds like the movie title for a great horror movie, doesn't it? Addressing what's beneath. No, but actually, what lies beneath sounds a little bit scary, and it should. Because inside all of us, the beneath bit of all of us is worthy of a little bit of wariness, right? I mean, we don't want to admit it because we're in church and we're all holy and good. But inside all of us, somewhere hidden deep, there's something a little dark. I mean, we're reading, and the reading that Emma got to us, and it will come on the screen in just a moment, I promise you. But we're reading this reading from the life of Moses. And we hear him as a baby thrown into the water. And then we see him as an old man. Well, not old, 40. What happens in the middle bit? I mean, what happens between him being a toddler and him becoming an old man, or at least middle-aged? Now, what happens in those 40 years? I think the bit that the Bible never talks about, the bit between verses 10 and 11, that's the really interesting bit. Moses grows up. What happened in those prevailing years? What made Moses the man he was today? What incidents, what accidents have shaped his life? If you read the book of Acts, it says a few things about Moses, which I know is a bit confusing for us. But in Acts 7, it says that Moses was 40 years when he fled. Now, 40 years is a bit of a catch-all number in the Bible. It just describes significant moments and significant times. So we shouldn't get hung up on whether he was actually literally 40 years old. But we do know decades have passed by since he's been this toddler raised out of a basket, or younger than toddler, baby really, raised out of a basket. And now he's this man. What's happened to him? What's his soul become like? It's safe to assume that he was baby, toddler, teenage, man. He's experienced love, discipline, relationship, palace life. He's trained and he's served. He's powerful, but he's weak. You see, by the time Moses gets to murdering an Egyptian, he's 40 years old. He's been raised in Pharaoh's house as an adopted son of Pharaoh's daughter. Stephen, later in the book of Acts, says, Moses was instructed in all the wisdom of the Egyptians and was mighty in words and deeds. Just imagine what that instruction would have been like in Pharaoh's palace, being raised as Pharaoh's grandson. He would, in all intents and purposes, been a prince of the household, educated to perhaps becoming the future Pharaoh. He'd have received great esteem, great power, riches. He'd have been taught to read and write. He'd have been taught mathematics and geography, animal husbandry, history. He'd have been taught military tactics. I mean, certainly he's skilled enough to take on the Egyptians on his own. No wonder at this point, age 40, Moses thinks that he's going to be the one to deliver God's people. 40-year-old Moses is strong. He's powerful. He's educated. He's skilled. He's got military clout, military knowledge, political insight. Surely he's God's man, right? He's one of the most powerful men of the kingdom, but he's weak inside here. And because he's weak inside here, he's heading for the wilderness. And let's just take a pause there. What are you like inside here? That deep, dark part of us. The part where, if we're lucky, our spouse may know our struggles, but most of the time it's hidden from absolutely everyone. Those bits we're ashamed of. The bits we're fearful someone might discover. Those bits where we wish we could turn the clock back and make a different decision because it's revealed the worst side of us. Or turn the clock back because those conversations we had, we can hope were never recorded. As I said, that's one of the biggest fears of young people today, that their mistakes on life are captured on a device forever. And then, of course, our deeper, darker side may not be hidden from everyone. Was Moses' anger really hidden? Or maybe, in that gap between verses 10 and 11, the decades, maybe his anger surfaced from time to time. Maybe the servants in the palace suffered from a harsh word or a raised hand. So how often do you and I actually address what's hidden beneath? Or do we just shrug our shoulders at the 100th time we've snapped at somebody and say, oh well, God's forgiven me, and we walk on? How often do we actually try and address the problems that are hidden beneath? Or as adults, have we grown so used to it that we just call it our foible? Oh, that's just them. That's just me. Without really addressing, no, that's a problem that needs looking at. There's a part of my soul that needs addressing. The thing is, as Moses discovered, if we don't address our character flaws, soon they seep deep into our souls. And it grows. And it affects every part of our life. And if we're not careful, it will land us in a wilderness. I meet a lot of youth workers who've done something that they're deeply ashamed of. They've fallen in an area. And you know what? The worst thing about it for them is that it leaves them isolated and alone. And at the time where perhaps they need relationship of church or of family or of friendship, they discover that that's gone. Because when you find yourself in a wilderness, you're on your own. And when you're in a wilderness, people tend to avoid you, particularly if you've put yourself there. But before we get too depressive, remember this. God does some of his best work in the wilderness. God does some of his best work in the wilderness. Trace it through the Bible. All, and I mean all, of God's important people, you know those key moments in the Bible, all of them faced a time of preparation in the wilderness. Even Jesus. So if you feel like you're in the wilderness, don't instantly assume that God has abandoned you. He might actually be preparing you for something. But the wilderness is a tough place to be. And it all unraveled for Moses. He lets his anger get the better of him. The people reject him. Pharaoh wants to kill him. And he's left with no other option but to flee to the wilderness. And he flees and he marries a fairly random priest's daughter. He has some kids, and he becomes a shepherd to the flocks of his father-in-law. His single attempt to take matters into his own hands has led to his dreams of grandeur coming crashing down. And I don't want to skip too quickly over that incident. Moses killed an Egyptian. As an adult, God tested Moses' heart by showing him the suffering of his fellow Jews. And Moses reacts out of anger. And you know the passage, we've had it read to us. And notice, before killing the Egyptian, Moses looked this way and that. Moses wasn't guilty of mere manslaughter. This wasn't an accident that took place. It wasn't something that happened in the heat of battle. No, Moses looks left and right first to make sure nobody's watching, and then kills him. This is first-degree murder. This was planned. I mean, what happens to a man's soul when you reach that point that you could kill somebody else? I wonder if Moses had dealt with the anger earlier, maybe he would never have reached the point that he could kill a man. See, at age 40, he was still in his physical prime. And he sees one of his fellow men wronged, and he defends them. I don't know if it was a single rush of anger, or whether it had been building for years and years and years as he watches the mistreatment of his fellow Hebrews. Maybe. Or maybe at that moment Moses was caught up in it and saw himself leading a Jewish revolt, like Barabbas did at Easter. But God had to transform Moses' mind and his soul before he could use him. And so most of you will know this if you're used to being in church, Moses enters 40 years of insignificance, 40 years languishing in the wasteland, 40 years of wondering what could have been. But God does some of his best work in the wilderness. And when we come to the next bit of Moses, he was 40 years weak but powerful. I don't know where I am, actually. I've lost all of this. I have not got a clue. Yeah, we'll stick there. I think I meant to write 80-year-old Moses is weak but powerful. 40-year-old Moses was powerful but weak. And here, 40 years on, he's weak, at least as far as the world views it, but he's powerful in here. 80-year-old Moses is weak, he's old, he's tired, he's lost any semblance of authority or of power. He's lost his contacts, he's lost his resources, he's even lost his previous reliance on self. He's now full of self-doubt. See, 4 long decades later, God meets Moses at the burning bush. And I know that's the passage for next week, so I won't go into it. But he's an ordinary shepherd in a forgotten area. His dreams have faded into oblivion. But God says, now I want to use you. I want to use this Moses, not that Moses. It's no wonder that Moses says, who am I that I should go to Pharaoh and bring out the children of Israel? Octogenarian Moses is weak. He can't even talk very well. Why would God choose him now? Moses has gone from, it makes sense that God would use me, to, who am I that God would use me? And in that change comes the demonstration that he's now ready. And it took him 80 years to get there. There's hope for me. God sort of deconstructs Moses' strength to show him who's really in control. God doesn't need Moses. Moses needs God. And of course, Moses' game plan has changed. He doesn't march into Egypt with an elaborate military strategy. He doesn't waltz in with an army behind him ready for rebellion. He limps in with a stutter and a stick. And through him, God overthrows the mightiest nation on the planet. God chooses the 80-year-old Moses, not the 40-year-old Moses, because the older Moses knows his weaknesses, and that becomes the platform for God's strength. And of course, who better? Who better at this point to lead God's people into the desert and into the promised land? A man who's had 40 decades learning about governance and leadership and lawyering and palaces and knowledge, coupled together with a man who's had 40 years of trying to survive in the hard scrabble wastelands of Israel, who knows what it is to find water, who knows what it is to eat food from the desert, who's a shepherd and knows how to lead as a shepherd leads and lead not as a king leads. I mean, who better? You see, God knew what he was doing in that preparation time. God doesn't need our impressiveness. He doesn't need our skills and our talents and our contacts and our resources. God uses broken jars of clay. He uses people who say, "Who am I that you would use me?" I think to care for our soul, we're called to embrace weakness, and then we experience true power. God may have given you some remarkable gifts. I know he has. But be careful, because that gifting may be the very thing that keeps you from caring for your soul, keeps you from being fruitful in your church. On whom shall we rely? It's easy to say, I rely on myself. But what we actually need to do is say, I rely on you, Lord. And God forgave Moses his sin. But you know what? He had to wait even another 40 years before God spoke to him again. And Abraham had to wait 13 years after he first heard from God, because he also fell. And when you look at most of the powerful people in the Bible, they all experience times of falling and of messing up. Moses had a temper that he never really got rid of. If you know your Bibles, when he led the Jews out into the wilderness, at one point, God told Moses to speak to the rock, for the rock to pour forth water. And of course, speaking to create is something only God can do. God wanted to say, this is me doing this. But what did Moses do? Moses wanted to do it in his own strength. So he went and beat upon the rock. That's a sure sign of an angry man. You see, Moses never really got rid of his temper. It was a constant trouble for him, a thorn in his flesh, to quote Paul. But Moses got there. Just as I begin to close, really, I once had the opportunity to go up in a plane. A friend of mine's got a private pilot license, and it was this two-seater plane. And when I was up there, I said to him, what's the hardest bit about flying? And he said, Matt, the hardest bit is learning to trust the instruments. Trusting those dials, he said, is the hardest thing. Because he said, all you want to do is trust in yourself. He said, you want to look out the window and decide whether you're at the right height, or you're going in the right direction, or that the flaps are in the right place. He said, you want to trust yourself. And he said, you can't do that flying a plane. You have to trust the instruments. And there's a bit of truth in that too for us walking day by day with God. We want to trust ourselves. We want to go, we know best. Of course, who better to know what's best for me than me, right? We have to learn to trust outside of ourselves. To not listen to my inner wants and desires, because that's a surefire way to destruction. Caring for our soul involves first recognizing what lies beneath. There's a shadow side to us all, a side which perhaps we don't love, a side of which we're embarrassed, but still lies within us all, a selfish, me first, I win side. And the walk of a Christian is constantly handing all of ourselves including the bit that lies beneath, handing it all over to Christ, trusting that he will mould and shape us into the person he wants us to be, the person we need to be. It's really interesting. If you read the story of Moses, we can read it through the lens of what we know to be true in the New Testament. We can read the story of Moses through the lens of the life of Jesus. And in a remarkable way, Moses is a kind of Christ type, a mirror, a saviour with a small s, to mirror the saving work of Jesus himself. God places Moses in the same Nile that Pharaoh intends for the boy's harm, and brings the boy right to Pharaoh's doorstep and has him raised in Pharaoh's house. Why? To defeat the enemy decisively at his own game, in the very heart of his strength. And that's what God wants to do with each one of us. He wants to take us and defeat the enemy decisively at his own game, in the very heart of his strength. Caring for our soul is a challenging task. If I'm any guide, I know that's true. I need God's help because my soul is a dark place sometimes. To gain victory over that impossible challenge, we must first relinquish control. Like Moses' parents did when they placed the basket in the Nile. And although Moses failed to properly express his anger at the injustice he saw, it was by faith that he chose to side with the oppressed people over the comfort of life that he could have had in the palace. Hebrews tells us by faith, Moses, when he'd grown up, refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter, choosing rather to endure the ill treatment of the people of God, rather than enjoy the passing pleasures of sin. Whether it's 100% true or not, we don't know. But according to the Jewish historian Josephus, he argues that Moses actually gave up his chance to become Pharaoh by siding with the Jews. Josephus says that Pharaoh had no other male heirs at the time, and Moses would have been Pharaoh. But he chose to side with God's people. God took what was bad and turned it into good. I'm going to ask the worship group to come up now, just as I close. When you repent, when you come back to God, God can use you no matter how serious your sin. You don't get much worse than deliberately killing a man. But most of the Bible is written by murderers. Have you ever thought about that? Most of the books of the Bible are written by somebody who's killed someone else. Humanly speaking, Moses' life, his influence and his power was over, but not for God, because reconciliation and restoration was possible. Your fall is never bigger than your call. God's mercy and grace in selecting a murderer to be his lawgiver is incredible. In the modern world, Moses would be called a hypocrite for murdering an Egyptian and then telling the Jews to live by the 10 Commandments, do not murder. In the modern world, he'd be called a hypocrite. But to God, he's the perfect person to give the law to because he understood the humility it would take. In accepting Jesus, in confessing our need for God's forgiveness and living in the freedom that brings, maybe that is the best way we can care for our soul. Let's sing together.